Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about major movement options and an exercise menu. And by major movement options, what I'm really referring to is those big exercises that sort of end up becoming the centerpiece or the cornerstones of our training programs. We might use these for testing, we might use these for training, we might use these as proof that our program is working. This might be what our whole program is based around. For a lot of lifters, they will piggyback off of the lifting sport that is powerlifting. That involves the squat, bench press, and deadlift. Another barbell sport is weightlifting, which includes the snatch and the clean and jerk. And you might use the 3 movements from powerlifting. You might use the 2 movements from Olympic weightlifting. You may include items such as pull-ups, bent over rows. You might use the overhead press. It used to be that the strict press was a well-respected and commonplace lift. It has just kind of faded out of style. It's faded out of style and not quite as popular anymore. It used to be that before the bench press, they would actually do a floor press, and it's my understanding that you would lay on your back and pull the bar over your head and then press your elbows into the ground and then press it up from the floor like that. And then they figured out that you could actually lift more doing a bench press. And so that's kind of why the bench press took over. So kind of whatever movements you choose to use, that's sort of your philosophy and kind of what you like to use. For me personally, if I'm coaching a team like wrestlers, I'm going to employ pull-ups for volume and heavy pull-ups, and I'm also going to do heavy one-arm rows because the sport of wrestling requires so much of that pulling motion. And then similar approach for my swim teams. I'm going to be concerned with their ability to perform pull-ups, not only for the strength that it shows in their upper back, which is very important for the majority of swim strokes, but also because when doing a good pull-up with strict core, it actually becomes a core exercise as well. So you have a hollow hold in my belief for the pull-up. So kind of whatever you want to do. If I've got an older client, something that might become a key cornerstone movement, maybe a 10-minute incline treadmill walk, something that's not a strength exercise per se, but is going to challenge their cardiovascular system, and it just becomes an exercise, an option. So kind of a deviation from the rest of these strength and power movements. But just an example of, choosing a movement or a challenge that is going to benefit the population that you're working with. Okay, so with these movement variations, let's kind of dissect a few of these here. Okay, with our squat, let's say we didn't want to squat and we wanted to do a front squat instead. You're going to get the majority of the benefits. Excuse me, I got a little cardio cough going on, so probably not gonna be the last time I cough today. I'll probably be sipping water in you guys' ears a little bit, so sorry about that. Let's say you didn't want to squat. Maybe your low back was bothering you a little bit, but you sort of played around with it, and you found that you were able to maintain a stricter front squat position and pattern, and you're able to front squat that day instead. No, it's not the exact same as a back squat, but you're going to get a lot of benefits out of it. So it's a great option, and you can even, maybe you have no reason to deviate from the squat other than to throw something different in there. And from the front squat, let's say you wanted to do an RFE split squat. Let's say your back hurt too much to do front squatting. Okay, well, when you go do the RFE split squat, you're going to handle a lot less weight. So sometimes, even though you're off balance and you're going unilateral, sometimes the back is happy with it because you're handling a fraction of the weight that you would in a back squat or a front squat. And if your back is really bothering you that day, just for the sake of example, if your back is really bothering you that day, maybe you could climb into a bell squat unit where that pressure totally circumvents your spine and goes right to your hips. And so even with very bad back pain, you could probably do some decent belt squatting that day. So we had some reasons and some rationale for having our different squat variations in this discussion. And you could come up with some more reasons to deviate from the bench press into some of these other presses. And the same thing for deadlifts, and the same thing for the clean and jerk, the same thing for the snatch. And whether you have injuries or you just want to mix it up, whatever, just know that you're going to get, because these movements are so similar, you're going to get some similar benefits. You're going to have similar muscles that are challenged. You're going to be going through similar movement patterns. In fact, sometimes to drive up these movements, we actually get away from them. So if I want to get better at squat, the best thing I can do is squat. That's the principle of specificity. But if I'm getting a little stale with my squat workouts, or my numbers are starting to plateau, one of the best things I can do is do a different kind of squat, which aligns with the principle of variation. And then for our purposes today, nothing against Olympic lifting, but because that's a whole other sport, and because it takes so much time to train and it's so much more technical, let's say, we're just going to kind of drop that off. So I apologize to my Olympic lifters out there, but just for the sake of simplifying things for our discussion, we're going to spend more time talking about squatting, bench pressing, and deadlift. And you could just as easily put in one arm rows, bent over rows, pull-ups. You could do plank holds for time. You could do a 10-minute incline treadmill walk. Not necessarily a strength movement, but a challenge that might give us some benefits for a certain population anyways. So just keep in mind that any movement you want to do, there's probably a similar movement that you could do. And you may want to know how to transfer your numbers from that movement you typically do, like the back squat, into a different exercise without having to test out that exercise. Okay, why would we change the classics? Why would we not squat, not bench press, not deadlift, or clean, or snatch? How about equipment? Now, a gym doesn't look like much of a gym if you've got no barbells. We're all used to seeing those barbells, but that doesn't mean that you can't have a great facility to train in and get some really good work done without a barbell in sight. So maybe you don't have barbells, like maybe a hotel gym, or somebody who designs a gym and it's just sort of going against the grain and filling up their space with other toys. Or take some of the time I spent training teams during COVID era and outside of COVID era, where we might train outside more often, just because it was hard to get into the facility, or maybe we're out at football practice and I've got a handful of athletes who are injured and they want me to do what you might call an injury island or a muscle beach, which is where you train the athletes on the sideline. Now, given a big enough staff and gators or golf carts to drag equipment over the field, I would gladly take some barbells out there and have athletes do RDLs and floor presses and bent over rows and things like that. but that's not always realistic in the situations we're in. But what's a little bit more realistic would be taking out some kettlebells, some dumbbells, some sleds, or some bands. So having the ability to substitute other equipment and other movements in to train some of our major movements is a big benefit, something to think about, whether it's from whatever reason. And if it's from injuries, another reason that you might, let's say let's go through a couple of examples here. So it's a shoulder issue. It's not so painful that they can't train, but it just really bothers them at the bottom of the bench press. And what you may have done is already tested that athlete's bench. Pardon me. What you may have done is already tested that athlete's bench press numbers. Let's say they're a 200-pound bench presser, but their shoulder hurts them today. You still want to do some training. You still want to make it specific to them. You could throw them on the floor, have them do some floor pressing, and take the numbers that 200-pound bench press that we tested and discovered, and now we can change it over, and we'll have numbers for our floor press. Commonly 90%. A floor press is going to commonly be 90%. We'll talk more about specifics later. I don't want to get into that too much. But a trained athlete or trained lifter, who floor presses regularly will often floor press about 90% of their bench press. Okay, what if that athlete had a low back issue? We kind of talked about this already, but you could easily put them in you could easily put them into a unilateral squat to save them some back pain. You're still training those legs and getting something beneficial out of the day. Let's say they're a 300-pound back squatter. Well, what's their unilateral squat going to be? Kind of depends on what squat pattern you choose. And just for the sake of not being redundant, I won't talk too much more about that. I'll get into it later. And what about a knee issue? What if they're coming back from soccer practice and they don't know what it is? There's no diagnosis. Their knees just don't feel good that day. So if you were going to have them deadlift or do a trap bar deadlift or something along those lines, maybe you just have them do some good mornings. So anytime looking at that bottom line there, anytime we reduce stability and or range of motion, it often allows us to simply just train around injuries. In fact, when stability is decreased, the muscle activation is often increased because the muscles will need to create the stability. Not a bad idea, especially when if we're training athletes who are out in an unstable environment, running around, and they are responsible for creating the stability. Okay, why change the classics? And by classics, I mean our major motions, our big moments that we might have tested earlier on in the year or the semester. And our variation principle suggests that minor changes in training regimens yield more consistent gains in sport performance. Again, just as we're starting to plateau, when we change the motion just a little bit, sometimes we get a great benefit out of that. We get some new stimulus, and then we get some new adaptation. We've talked about key performance indicators before. Specifically, we have a video on it in our principles of optimal performance, exercise principles of optimal performance course. So I don't want to be too redundant and dive into KPIs too much, but essentially some exercises help build other exercises, such as the floor press is going to drive the bench press. So if you get stuck halfway in your bench press or towards the top end of your bench press, more floor pressing may very well help you defeat that weakness. RDLs are likely to drive your hang clean performance. Your vertical jump will likely drive your sprint. If you get one higher, if you can test or perform one higher and become stronger, more powerful, one is likely to improve the other. What about the hang clean driving the vertical jump? It absolutely should. It's almost an identical movement. The hang clean being, what is it? More or less a weighted jump. Pardon me. But if you watch the hang clean be performed with maximal weights, it's so heavy that it's no longer a power exercise like a jump. It becomes a strength movement. The bar speed is reduced to a speed so slow that it shifts from a power movement to a strength movement. And Dr. Brian Mann discovered this working at Mizzou when they were testing their athletes, and he was working on his PhD. And he went to do a regression analysis. He was writing a paper about what exercises the athletes were testing on and comparing it to their vertical jump. And he was thinking it would be a no-brainer that their hang cleans would drive the performance of their vertical jumps. And after taking a couple of times to run I believe it's called a regression analysis, he was getting the hang clean was like the third or fourth item on the list that related and correlated to the vertical jump. It was like bench press and body fat were the top two. And then he went and spoke to a professor who had done more regression analysis than he had. And the professor said, no, you got it right. That's just how the data plays out. And so they had to go back and revisit the importance of hang cleans. Is that the hang clean done for power at a certain velocity will very much so drive the vertical jump. But when done for maximal loads, it becomes a strength exercise and does not carry over into the quick, powerful movement that is a vertical jump. So one thing to watch out for is KPIs that aren't actually addressing the weaknesses that you think they are, that they're not actually driving the movements that we think they are. And not using barbells or typical movements may just boil down to your philosophy. Coach Mike Boyle, very well respected, sort of a thought leader. He's an author, he's a speaker. He's had success in the private sector and working with professional teams and large groups of athletes. I included an article there about basically why they've moved away from barbells. And, looking at the 4 bullet points, instead of doing barbell deadlifts, they do trap bar deadlifts. Instead of doing barbell pressing, they do dumbbell pressing. Instead of doing barbell squatting, they do dumbbell single leg squatting or a type of goblet squat. Instead of doing pull-ups or barbell or pull-ups on a bar or barbell rows, they tend to do them from rings. So they're just and the reason being, as he says there, to sum up, straight bars go a long way toward determining bar paths. And I'm not sure that is a good thing for our joints, particularly our shoulder joints. So just the philosophy is that this coach who's been in the field for multiple decades has kind of come to the conclusion that athletes who are not barbell athletes, they're not in CrossFit, they're not in powerlifting, they're not in weightlifting. They want to play hockey or baseball or soccer or wrestle or whatever they're doing. If they're not a slave to the barbell, then you might be better off using other items. And maybe they come to you and they have barbell numbers and you want to find ways to transfer those numbers into dumbbell numbers without taking one step back and doing some testing. You'd be able to roll right into their next lift by just taking the information they have from using barbells, and you can simply substitute the movement for whatever reason and have a fairly accurate batch of numbers to train off of. And that's where the exercise menu comes into play. some more coaches and some ratios from one movement to another. So when we create our exercise menu, what we'll be able to do is look at a major movement and maybe set that as 100%. So maybe the back squat would be whatever your 100% back squat is. Then you can create ratios for a front squat without having to test the back squat, the front squat, the split squat, the rear foot elevated squat, the reverse lunge, the step up. By just doing a squat or one of the other movements, if you have an exercise menu, you can then fill in the gaps and do some training without having to test out every single movement if you rely on and use percentages. Christian Boss uses a front squat ratio of somewhere between 80 and 90%. And as he says, this means that you can front squat 89% of the weight that you can back squat. And I would say from what I've seen, and nothing against Christian Boss, but from what I've seen, if you have someone who front squats just as much as they back squat, just as often, not as much, not the same poundage, but if you have someone who front squats just as frequently as they back squat, then yes, 80% is going to be a more reasonable number. But from what I've seen, very few individuals in sort of our general athletic population, very few of those athletes are front squatting as frequently as they're back squatting. And so what that would mean is that I would actually lower those numbers to more like 70%. And if they're crushing all of the front squat numbers, you can raise them at a later date, but I would advise actually a little bit lower than that. No offense to Christian Boss. Dave Tate, I've seen him talk about it in a video. I tried finding it for you guys to add a link in here. But since I've also seen him speak about it at an elite FTS clinic, I'm just gonna sit back and use my firsthand reference is having heard him say it in person, is that he'll use the floor press is about 90% of the bench press. And that way, if someone's never floor pressed before, but they've got that shoulder injury, this, that, or the other, or if they haven't floor pressed in a long time, then you can kind of just roll into and know that, okay, well, you bench press 200 pounds, so your floor press number is going to be about 180 pounds. Now, there is room for error on that. So take me, my shoulders are not the best, and I enjoy floor pressing. So it's something I do regularly, but I'll actually end up floor pressing about 105% of my bench press. It feels better on my shoulders. I enjoy doing more tricep work than the average bear. So maybe those things combined is kind of why I just end up floor pressing a little bit more. And then reaching back to Mike Boyle again. Well, before I move to Mike Boyle, if you don't know who Dave Tate is, he's a very successful powerlifter, and his company Elite FTS provides not only free information on their website, but they also are a great organization for getting strength and fitness equipment. And he's an interesting kind of foul-mouthed strength coach and source of knowledge. So yeah, he's entertaining and he knows what he's talking about. And then we'll go back to Mike Boyle again. And he uses the dumbbell weight is going to be about 80% of barbell weight. And then you divide it in half, right? So if I have a 200-pound bench presser, then what are we going to do? They're going to be about 160 pounds total on their dumbbell press, which, because the way the dumbbells work, means that we're looking to have about 80 pounds in each hand for a very heavy sort of one rep max. If they're a 200-pound bench presser, 80 pounds per hand is going to be a very difficult rep for them, theoretically. And I found that to be a pretty good number. I found that to be a pretty good number, whether it is horizontal pressing or vertical pressing. And Mike will also have the incline bench press be about 80% of the regular bench press. So as you shift angles and your joints become less stable and some of your big muscles are sort of taken out of the game, you're just not going to bench press as much at an incline angle. If you're 95 out of 100 lifters are just going to lift more on a flat bench press than on an incline bench press. So that change makes 80% of a bench press. So if we were to take a flat bench press number of 200 pounds, and then we were going to go 2 movements away, if we're going to do dumbbells, and then we're going to do incline dumbbells, in theory, and this may be off, could very easily be off, but in theory, we'd be looking for 64% of 200 pounds. So you'd say that they had 128 pound maximal for their incline dumbbell bench press, and that would be 128. That'd be 64 pounds per hand would be a heavy rep. So you would train off of 128 pounds total, or a 65 pound number would be your new 100% for a dumbbell incline press. Okay, so looking at some squat substitutes, if we are looking to activate and train the same muscle groups and not being quite as worried about movement pattern, the sled march is an excellent replacement, especially if somebody's got a strained low back. That takes all the pressure off of them. You're not always going to have a belt squat machine. So a sled march where a belt goes around your hips and it skips over, stressing out your lower back. And then you put some weight on that sled and you have the athletes dragging around, their legs are going to get smoked. It really, really picks on them. And no low back pain. Or if they can handle some load, again, you can do box step ups, cable split squats, front foot elevated split squat, rear foot elevated split squat. And just realize that whenever you have your exercise menu and you're pulling in different numbers, if an athlete has never done a rear foot elevated split squat before, they're not going to be good for 50% right off the bat. And working with younger athletes in the, in the college area, pardon me, sorry guys. I've used the rear foot elevated split squat as a squat substitute. I really like using it for football teams in season. And what I would do is back squat test them or have previous numbers from summertime training. And once we got in season, for several different reasons, I would move away from the back squat. It has more stress on their central nervous system because of if they're a 400 pound squatter, then they've got 400 pounds on their back. Force plate scans show that football players improve their squat patterns, rugby players improve their squat patterns naturally throughout rugby season. And we can assume the same for football players who are constantly getting down into a low squatting athletic position, especially our linemen. So if we're already getting better at the squat pattern and we're under great amounts of stress from the field in practice and play, maybe doing more unilateral squatting in season would be a benefit. And playing off of that, I had some success. I had athletes feeling good, moving good weight, and really pretty low injury rates. So I stand by that approach. Although I've seen it done other ways, I've seen it done with back squatting throughout the season, and I've seen that work really well as well. So when I took those athletes who have never rear foot elevated split squat before, the first couple of times I do it with them, It's like riding a bike with training wheels. They're sloppy, they're all over the place. But once they start to get the hang of it, their strength numbers skyrocket. So it goes somewhere along the lines of an athlete who might have some tight hips that are not exposed in a bilateral squat. They might be doing, just more than body weight, maybe an empty barbell their first time out. And then a couple of times later, they might be doing 30% of the weight that they should be doing on a given day. And then once they've got they kind of know where to put their foot, and they kind of find their groove, and they find the right height for everything, and they kind of get the hang of it. Honestly, it's pretty common that a lot of them are doing 50% or more. I believe 44% after a couple of years of really kind of fine tuning my RFE programming. I think 44% is kind of where I ended up putting them for in-season training. Some more reasons on the right for unilateral squatting would be bilateral limb deficit. So one leg is stronger than the other. With rib flare or pelvic tilt, it's just that kyphosis and lordosis is just the body not being in a good spot. Unilateral lifts, are going to give some greater balance benefits. Foot position, we're going to improve our ankle mobility. Depth, a lot of times especially with the asymmetrical femurs into the acetabulum, is a lot of times our hips are not even within a single individual. And so a full linear, beautiful squat, it really means that something gross is happening on the inside, is that there's some stressors taking place on the inside. So sometimes squatting to depth is not ideal. And then as far as trunk strength goes, yes, it is a shame that we're not loading up as much weight on our trunk, but what you have to realize is that the bilateral squat, your typical squat, is going to be training your core and your trunk much more than it is your legs. So if you're really just trying to train your legs, the unilateral squat is a faster method there. Take an athlete who maybe squats 500 pounds, back squat 500 pounds is very respectable. And then you go and put them on a leg press. Sometimes they're going to leg press over 1,000 pounds, depending on what machine or what unit they're on. It's because it takes their trunk weakness out of the equation, and they're just expressing leg strength. Our legs tend to be much, much stronger than our squats, our back squats express, because our trunk is the real weakness, is the real weak link. Pardon me, got a little tongue tied there. Okay, I don't need to talk too much here, kind of going off of some of the things that I was just talking about. Yeah, it looks like I ended up on my RFEs. I was using 43%. So I would do maybe a training week to acclimate, and then I would challenge them to a squat workout based off not necessarily doing 43% of their back squat numbers, but based off of 43% of their back squat numbers. And we do that for a few weeks. And then we might shift over to a split squat or a lateral squat, in which case we would do a lighter week of acclimation. And then we would train not necessarily using 48% of their back squat, but based off of 48% of their back squat. And then going into our third phase there, we would do step ups with a box height of below the knee. That's what that BK is. And we would base that off of 55% of their back squat. And on the bottom row there, some movements that I really like in theory, but they showed themselves to be troublesome because of turf toe issues, would be the reverse alternating lunge, the flat regular split squat, and the front foot elevated split squat. Okay, movement variations. So I just pulled our chart from several charts ago, and I brought in some percentages. So now that you guys kind of with me in the know a little bit more about how we find some of these percentages or where they come from, I thought we'd go through a few of them. Okay, we talked about how our 100% squat, our back squat would really be about 70 to 80% of our front squat. Again, if you're squatting as frequently as if you're front squatting as frequently as you're back squatting, you might be more to that 80%. If you're not, if you're front squatting rarely, you're probably more of a 70%, maybe even lower, especially that front squat that demands some lat flexibility and some shoulder mobility. So if you're having trouble getting in position, you've got other problems to kind of deal with. Our RFE split squat, so that should be 43 to 54%. Again, there's a learning curve there. But once athletes get the hang of it, their numbers really kind of do great things. And something I don't think I mentioned it earlier is the bilateral limb deficit. Why would our RFE split squats, why would we be squatting more than 50% of our back squat? Back squat is stable, uses both legs on the ground. When we get into that awkward RFE position and all of a sudden we are squatting off of one leg, that's pretty strange that we would anticipate maybe squatting heavier than half of the back squat. Well, there's a few reasons for it, but one of them is the bilateral limb deficit. And what that means is that if we think about our brain as sort of a battery, and it's going to send electricity, aka nerve signals, out to our body, if it sends it to both legs in a back squat, the energy, the nerve signal gets divided out into two limbs. But when the brain is just talking to one leg, it's going to get a little bit of a stronger impulse. It's going to get a little bit more juice. So that's why sometimes when we do a single limb exercise, we're actually stronger than half of a double limb exercise. That's bilateral limb deficit. And then looking at the belt squat, again, our core, our trunk is our weak point. Most humans, it's going to be their weak point in the squat. So we can basically assume the belt squat is going to be heavier. Depending on your belt squat, depending on a lot of things, I don't know how much heavier it's going to be, but 120% seems reasonable from a handful of belt squat units I've used, but I can't say for sure. Okay, same thing for bench press. Most humans are going to be strongest at the bench press. And then it's going to be about 9% on the floor press. I've heard Dave Tate discuss that. Oh my gosh, guys, I'm really sorry. I got cardio cough. I went out and was running a little obstacle course earlier today, and now I'm annoying you guys with my cough and my water drinking. Sorry. Okay, so the floor press is at 90%. I've heard Dave Tate speak about it. I borrowed his numbers on it, his theory, and I've been programming the floor press at 90% of bench press for a handful of years now, and it works pretty darn well. Dumbbell floor press at 72% of your bench press number. How do you get to 72%? Where is that coming from? That seems really random, right? Well, let's take the fact that we're doing a floor press. So we're at 90%. Now we're doing a dumbbell floor press. So remember, our dumbbells are 80%, right? So of the 100% here, when you take 90% of that, and then 80% of that 90%, you end up at 72% of that original 100%. So you can start to do things like that. And my math might be off. Let me know if it is. But you can start to do things like that to maybe take an athlete who, okay, a wrestler who comes in and both shoulders hurt. One shoulder hurts too much to do any lifting. The other shoulder hurts only at the bottom range of motion. So they want to do a dumbbell one arm floor press, or something like that. So now you kind of have some numbers. Or their shoulders hurt, and they don't want to do a barbell. Remember what Mike Boyle was saying earlier about the bar determining the bar path and not liking that for our joints, specifically the shoulder. So maybe your wrestler comes in and both shoulders hurt, and so they want to do some pressing, but they just want to do something shoulder friendly. So you say do dumbbell floor presses, and that's how you could get some numbers. Alternating dumbbell press. Okay, 50%, pretty good. Now remember, if they're on dumbbells, all right, guys, I think I'm coughing out the last of it there. Sorry about that. If we're alternating dumbbell, if we're on dumbbells, shouldn't we kind of be at 80%? Okay, but if it's dumbbells, then that 8% becomes 40. But when it's alternating, remember that bilateral limb deficit and how it kind of gives us a little sub, like a cheat code secret benefit. So instead of being 40%, it's 50%, because our brain is better able to activate the muscles in that one limb that's going to be pressing. Okay, for our deadlifts at 100%. How about a below the knee? That's what BK is in my little shorthand there. A BK rack pull. So below the knee rack pull. So you're skipping that first pull of the deadlift, and you're starting at an advantage position. So you could program it for 110%. Okay, RDL at 68%. Well, where do you get that? I'm going to show you guys in a moment. Is that I have a couple of exercise menus from other people who I've never even met. I don't know them at all, but I've gotten them from other coaches, and I've tested the waters a little bit with them. And so I have some numbers that I'm just going to share with you guys. If anybody ever wants to document, just let me know. I'm happy to share it. They come from places that the people who made them are long gone. So different universities and the staffs there were in place probably a dozen or 15 years ago at the earliest. So you could reach out and say, hey, your numbers are all wrong, but they won't even know what you're talking about. It's from a different era. And then a single leg assisted RDL. Single leg assisted RDL would be 45%. Okay. All right, so let's do this. We're not done, guys. Stick with me, but we won't be going very much longer at all. All right, we're sharing. We got a new share going on here. Okay, so I've collected exercise menus from a few different sources, and I put them all into one file here. And if anybody wants this, reach out to me and I'll be happy to share. I didn't make it up, but I have found quite a few of them to be very useful. And so if you want to do cleans and variations here, there's several variations. And again, your clean would be 100%. So you base all these movements and the numbers, subsequent numbers off of clean numbers. And then the same thing for snatches. Again, I chose not to talk much about that today, but even it's in here. So I'm not going to spend much time on here. I'm just going to kind of go through slowly on a couple of different screens. And that way, if you guys want to pause it and screenshot it and remake it, that's cool. Or reach out to me and I'm happy to just email it to you. Just really no problem at all. Upper body movements, lower body movements. Similar approach here, just a different looking chart. So a lot of these numbers would be based off of your hang clean 1RM, and all the numbers kind of underneath that are based off of those things until you get to your back squat down here, and then that becomes your 1RM. So again, that becomes a major movement, and then you can use your hang clean or your back squat to derive numbers for other lifts. And I'm just going to go through this kind of quickly here. We are really close to the end here, guys. I want you to stick with me for a second just so I can show you guys these different. Okay, this is my last one. Get up here. Just so you guys have it. Again, pause it and retype it or steal it or use whatever you want. Awesome. That is it. Yeah, so really I just want to encourage everyone to do some testing, but be prepared to shift away from certain movements, okay? And you don't have to do the back squat as your testing numbers or as your central movement, your big movement. You can do that with the front squat, and then you can just increase the number of your front squat to find your back squat, because the numbers work upward as well. And I would just encourage everyone, I think as a lifter, as a young lifter and as a younger coach, one of the things that I wish I could have redone is sticking with the same movements just over and over and over again. If I could go back, I would throw in some variation. So that's just kind of comes with experience and making mistakes. But yeah, hopefully today, I know not the most exciting day, but hopefully today just kind of gives you guys an idea of how to base different numbers off of other exercises, and that you're not constantly testing every little thing and then try and train off those testing numbers. It's okay to kind of take this path where we test a few things and then we're able to create some numbers off of those. So I hope this is helpful. I'm very sorry about all the coughing. I will try to get my cardio done away from my next recording. All right. Thanks, guys.